Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We are going to get started here in about 10 minutes, but before we do, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items with those of you that have joined us today. For those of you that we do have in the room, the first thing I would like to make mention of is our chat pod, which is located on the left-hand side of your screen marked chat. This chat pod will be the best way to communicate with us if you have any questions regarding today's material. All questions pertaining to the material will be retained until the Q&A session that will be held at the very end of today's webinar. So please make sure at any time of today's presentation to go ahead and type in your questions there in the chat pod, and we will pull them out and hold them in our Q&A cache, and then we'll get them answered during our Q&A session at the completion of the presentation today. This chat pod is also the best way to communicate with us should you experience any technical issues. If you do have any technical issues, please make sure to let us know there in the chat, and either myself or one of our customer service representatives will make sure to get you taken care of. All of your audio for today's event is going to be streaming through your computer speakers, so if for any point during today's presentation you do lose audio, we would suggest that you refresh your web browser. Most of the time that will reset your connection and will restart your audio, and that fix also works just in case your slides in the live feed stop as well. So if for any reason you do experience any technical issues, the best thing to do first is just to refresh your page and then hit the play button again on your live feed. And if for some reason that does not work, just let us know in the chat and we will be sure to get you taken care of. We are going to get started here again in about 8 minutes. So before we do get started, I would like to find out a little bit more about our audience. We do have some people that have already come into the room. So for those of you that we do have in, if you wouldn't mind just typing in your location where you're watching today's webinar from in the chat pod, not only will that give us some great feedback about our audience, but that will also ensure that your chat pod is in fact working for you. So if you wouldn't mind taking a few moments to do that before we get started, we would greatly appreciate it. Today is a follow-up webinar of Dr. Christiansen's talk that was given back in December. We have been able to give him another time slot and 30 additional minutes to be able to present. So we're going to not only hear some of the great information that he presented before, but we're also going to be able to hear some of the some additional information that was not able to be covered due to the shortened time frame of the last event. So we're very excited to have Dr. Christiansen back. We are going to get started here in about 7 minutes. I'm going to mute my line back for now. We'll let the rest of the participants come in, and then we will go through housekeeping once more and get started at the top of the hour. Thank you for joining us today. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We are going to get started here in just a couple of minutes, but before we do, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items with those of you that have just come into the room. For those of you that have just joined us, the first thing I would like to make mention of is our chat pod, which is located on the left-hand side of your screen marked chat. This chat pod is the best way to communicate with us should you have any questions regarding today's material. All questions pertaining to the material will be retained until the Q&A session that will be held at the very end of today's presentation. So please make sure at any point of today's talk, if you do have a question for Dr. Christiansen, go ahead and type that there in the chat pod, and we'll pull that out and house that for our Q&A session that will be held again at the very end of today's talk. This chat pod is also the best way to communicate with us should you experience any technical issues. If you do have any technical issues, please make sure to let us know there in the chat, and either myself or one of our customer service representatives will make sure to get you taken care of. All of your audio for today's event is going to be streaming through your computer speakers. So if at any point of today's talk you do lose audio, the first thing we would like for you to do is to refresh your page, refresh your web browser, and then simply hit the play button again, and that should reestablish your connection with the audio. You can also do this just in case your slides freeze for any reason, or you do lose the slides in your live feed. Just simply refresh your browser and then hit the play button again on the live feed, and everything should reconnect for you. We have found that the best web browsers to use for our new platform are Mozilla Firefox and Google Chrome. So if you are able to utilize one of those platforms, that should give you the best user experience possible. I do see a few of you have posted in the chat pod where you are listening to from today. If you have not, we would definitely like to find out a little more about our audience. So if you could take a few moments before we do get started just to type in your location there in the chat pod. Not only will that give us some great feedback about our audience and who is joining us, but that will also make sure that your chat pod is working properly before we do get started. It is the top of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and mute my line back. I'll make some adjustments, and then we will get started here shortly. Thank you for joining us today. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Josh Vickers, and I'm with RTI International's Forensic Technology Center of Excellence, and I will be your technical host and moderator for today's event. Today's event is a follow-up of Dr. Christiansen's original webinar that occurred in December of 2018. We have been able to extend his time slot to an hour and a half this time, which will give him more time to be able to address some of his research as well as the topics he was not able to discuss in the first webinar. So our webinar today is entitled Psychological Survival in a Violent Career. Again, this is a follow-up. Our subject matter expert today is Dr. David Christiansen. Dr. Christiansen is a licensed psychologist in Colorado and has been in private practice for more than 30 years. Much of that time devoted to working with first responders by conducting pre-employment evaluations, fit-for-duty evaluations, and providing therapy to many first responders from various disciplines. He has also provided numerous trainings around the country with the intent to inoculate first responders from the effects of PTSD and to provide amelioration for those already affected with the negative consequences. Dr. Christiansen maintains an active private practice as well as serving many agencies as a consultant, and he previously taught as an adjunct faculty member at the University of Northern Colorado in both the undergrad and graduate programs in psychology. Just our quick disclaimer, the opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of Justice. Any products and manufacturers discussed are presented for informational purposes only and do not constitute product approval or endorsement by the U.S. Department of Justice. And now, without any further ado, I would like to hand the platform and the microphone over to our subject matter expert and presenter for today, Dr. David Christiansen. Dr. Christiansen?
And welcome. I appreciate you attending today. I look forward to the next hour and a half or so with you to discuss psychological survival. I want to start by just telling you that I appreciate the work that you do with whatever regards you have, whatever role you play in the law enforcement community. Most often I've spoken to crime scene investigators, who are kind of the unseen professionals who come along and provide important information for justice. And I appreciate what you folks do, and often you go unthanked for that. Thank you, too, for the police officers and others who are in the audience that do the work that you do. My 30 years of working in the field has really given me an appreciation for what folks do and the emotional cost that it takes to continue to do this work. So first of all, thank you for attending, and thank you for the work that you do. I've got the first slide up there, and I wanted to start with an anecdote.
Dr. Christiansen, we're not able to see your slides yet. If you want to make sure that you are sharing your screen.
Okay.
You just navigate back to the Blue Jeans web browser and then hit your share screen button. That should bring up the option for you. All right, we can see your screen now. If you just want to bring up your presentation. Perfect. And then just hit the hide button there at the bottom on your Blue Jeans is sharing your screen. And you are good to go.
All right. I'll resume with the anecdote. I'm a college freshman and walking into a class on philosophy with Dr. Melvin Stewart, and was just mesmerized by the man's knowledge and his intellect and his lectures, even though I don't feel like I understood a single word that he said. But I was just enthralled with philosophy and with what he was sharing with me. It was such brand new information. Because I didn't understand the lectures, I would often go to his office in between classes and ask him to summarize it. And he would sit back on his desk and explain to me his lecture in a shortened format. And I would walk out of his office thinking, I didn't understand what he said in his office either. I felt totally overwhelmed by what philosophy meant. But I studied hard and I read the materials, and I ended up getting an A in the class in college, which surprised me. So I took a second and then a third class from Dr. Stewart and had the same experiences, just overwhelmed with how important philosophy was and how it was an undercurrent to everything that we do, and eventually ended up with a minor in philosophy, which I appreciate but didn't really use. 20 years later, when I'm studying for my doctoral comprehensives, I was asked to organize all of my class notes from about 25 different classes that I'd taken for my comprehensive exams, and I had no idea how to separate those folders into meaningful ways of learning. And like an apparition or an epiphany, Dr. Stewart showed up in my office at 2 o'clock in the morning and said, "Remember what I told you?" And suddenly all of his lectures from 20 years before became clear to me. And I broke down the psychological classwork that I'd done into 3 categories, which I'll share with you. And it has since just been a huge paradigm for me to understand life this way. I'm going to start by sharing philosophy with you, and I hope that you'll really tune into this. Some of you may be familiar with philosophy and schools of thought. For others, it may be brand new and it may be hard to grasp the first time. It certainly was for me. The first thing I got from Dr. Stewart was that people gain truth, or they gain knowledge, or they gain certainty in their lives by empirical evidence. They gain it through their 5 senses. People who have seen it for themselves, heard it, tasted it, touched it, etc., they believe that things are true because of their own sensory data. And some philosophers in the past believe that that's the only way that we learn. It certainly is the beginning way that we learn is through sensory data. If you look at Freud in the oral stage of psychology, it's basically an orientation to the world through taste and through the mouth. So the 5 senses become one way for us to gain information. We start out as a blank slate and we begin to collect physical evidence, physical information through our senses that form truth for us. If we hold strictly to science, if we look straight at what empiricism and what science is, it is always observable and measurable, and I would add repeatable, that true science has these features to it, that when you have an empirical science, when you proclaim something as true scientifically, it should be observable and measurable and repeatable. It should happen on every continent. It should happen at every temperature, and so on, that we know things to be true because we can repeat them. We can see them in a laboratory. That's the best way of doing science. Following that, if we believe in science, if we believe that information is basically biologically obtained through sensory data, then what we look at inside of our skull is the brain. It's the 3-pound mass of muscle that is electronic in nature and soaked in water, and yet it performs all these duties. A person who looks at the brain as the core of being a human being, they begin to look at stress and anxiety and trauma and PTSD and any other form of mental illness specifically through the brain first. And this is where psychiatry would differ from psychology, in that psychiatry would say there's a medication for that. And so they would promote looking at mental health illness, looking at stress, looking at anxiety, primarily through the brain, primarily through medication. And unfortunately, our culture has bought into that a lot, that we typically look at things this way. So if a person in law enforcement does have a mental health condition, they can still be seen as being mentally deficient or having some kind of a limitation that is really not accurate. Following that slide, you see that science, which I've covered before, and you look at behavior. That is an impressive way of gaining information. However, a second way that we obtain truth is through cognition, through rationalism, through understanding. If things are logical and reasonable, they make sense to us. So if I were to ask you, is your car still parked in the parking lot? You would say yes, with a logical certainty that your car has not been moved, it's not been stolen. Even though you can't see it or taste it or touch it, etc., you know that your car is there based on logic. And so Socrates and Plato essentially espoused a philosophy which says that if things make sense to us logically or they're reasonable, we can assume that they are true. And all of you and myself, we make truthful conclusions based on logic, based on reasoning, even though our sensory data is not involved. We have a reason to believe that things stay the same when we leave the room. In contrast to the brain, people who follow this train of thought don't see the mass of muscle inside of our skulls as the brain, they see it as the mind. So much more than just providing neurological information, the mind is capable of conceptualizing. It has thoughts and ideas and hopes and dreams that are beyond what the brain would account for. But the mind is a capacity of a person to think irrationally, to have dreams, to have hopes, to have a mindset, if you will, that's much different than the brain. If the problem is in the mind, we wouldn't treat that with medication. We would treat that with a cognitive therapy, or a way of a person's looking at life and interpreting that. The mind is much different than the brain in this way, in that the mind has a capacity to do things that are not biologically understood. We can certainly medicate the brain. We can certainly probably lift anxiety and depression and so on with medication. But if we look at the mind and how a person thinks, it's an entirely different approach to looking at mental health issues, to looking at stress, to looking at PTSD, to looking at burnout, and all the factors that go into what happens to individuals, especially those who are in the field of law enforcement and first responding, because they are exposed to trauma far more often than the ordinary person. I've often said in my trainings that since the development of the telephone, and especially cell phones, my response to trauma most often is to call 911, whereas when I was a child, people would respond to it in person. They would get on scene and help others really for a much longer period of time. At this point, if I stop at a car accident, I may stop for a few minutes and make a phone call, but soon professionals are on the scene. And basically, not only do I hand off the medical aspects of the patient, I hand off the trauma. I hand this to people who I say, you take it from here. Crime scene investigators and paramedics and EMTs and so on that look at information like this can be affected in their mind, whereas it may not actually be the brain that's involved, and they certainly don't need medication for that. I won't elaborate on this next part of the slide with math and physics, but math and physics are basically the preeminent forms of logic or reasonableness that we have, because essentially they are not supposed to change. Mathematical formulas are not supposed to change. They're supposed to stay stable, and so they're logically based, and physics is logically based. In the last part of that slide, you'll see the words thinking and feeling, and from the mind comes these two alternative ways of approaching life. One is through thinking, our cognition, how we make sense of the world, and the other is more of an intuitive sense or a feeling sense that can be much different than thinking. Thinking is most often grounded in factual information and things that we're certain about, whereas feelings are often based on things that may not be real, or they're certainly not real in the moment. Third school of philosophy that Dr. Stewart expounded to me that occurred basically hundreds of years later was the existential movement, which essentially initially had a negative connotation to it, that existentialism was seen as negative and focused on death and dying and hardship, and that life is difficult, and that it's basically, it can be a worthless pursuit. But existentialism, I think, initially had a very bad connotation to it, but as I've looked over the years, existentialism is basically a form of learning or a form of believing truth that's based on the heart. It's based on something that we just know to be true, even in spite of our physical senses or in spite of our logic, we know it to be true in our heart. For example, falling in love, it may not make sense to somebody else economically why we do that, or reasonably, or physical attraction is not the same between the two people. Other forms of typical attraction to people is not present, but in the person's heart, they know that they love the other person, so it becomes an existential experience, an existential truth. I know in my heart that I love this person, despite the odds, despite what other people say. Existentialism also shows itself in the calling or the purpose that a person may have in their lives, that existentialism is that calling. I'm guessing that many of you listening today have had a calling to help others, and you've had a calling or a purpose in life that you want to serve in your communities. You want to be helpful to other people. And so specifically it led you into law enforcement or into crime scene investigation or to be a law enforcement officer or sheriff's deputy. But it's a calling inside your heart. It's not based on the financial rewards that come from it. It's not based necessarily on logic to put yourself in harm's way or to expose yourself to trauma. But in your heart, you know that this is what you're supposed to do. This is your calling. I've had the privilege of knowing that from my own career. I'm not sure that I knew that starting out, but as I've gone through 30 years of work, I realized I'm doing my calling. I'm doing something that means something to my heart, and that becomes my anchor. It doesn't matter if the money goes up and down. It doesn't matter if sometimes it doesn't seem logical to continue doing what I'm doing. My heart is in the right place, and therefore my career feels stable based on existential factors, much more so than income or convenience or other factors that go into that. Existentialism appeals to the aesthetic. It appeals to art. It appeals to feng shui. It appeals to how a person just generally feels about their work, about their life, about their home life, etc. It's most often individual and autonomous in that when we have an existential truth, many times it's not shared by other people. We may hear a song, see a painting, experience a sunset that we just think is absolutely phenomenal, but when we share it with other people, they don't resonate with the same excitement that we do. So oftentimes existential feelings or existential truth is individual in nature. It doesn't have to make sense to other people. Oftentimes they don't understand it. Oftentimes they take what we've said and interpret it through their own history, and they may minimize it. So this is where you have people who share about maybe the death of a pet, and the person listening just says, well, you can get a new pet, or they say the wrong thing back to us because they don't understand that the pet that died was really a close companion to us. That's what an existential truth would be. It doesn't make sense to a non-pet owner. It doesn't make sense to somebody who hasn't felt that way, but to another person who has had a bond with a pet, they do understand what you're talking about. From this, we get truth that is in the heart. You have a truth that says, I know this to be true, despite the evidence or despite the logic in my heart. I know that this is true. This leads to the artistic and creative side of ourselves, in that we design our lives not just with art and with creative acts, but with our homes, with how we decorate, with how we dress, with how we present ourselves, that all of this becomes individual and artistic and creative in nature. As I mentioned, it can defy the senses or logic. It doesn't have to make sense to somebody else. Why would I quit a high-paying job, start my own business? Well, it's because this is what I really want to do with my life. And so I'm guessing that many of you listening have had experiences in your life where you chose something, you made a decision, you believed something to be true, despite what other people around you agreed with. So maybe you took a year off in college and traveled, and folks warned you that you'd never go back to college, you wouldn't finish your education, and you took that year off, and it's magical. It becomes a centerpiece of your history. The problem with existential truth is it can lead to freedom or despair. If you quit a high-paying job to start your own business, you could have great rewards, that the income that you have is derived from your own initiative, from your own way of running a business, but the business could also fail, and you end up with despair that other people shake their heads and say, why did you quit the high-paying job in the first place? So existential truth, which I would say is also experiential truth, has either of those two outcomes to it. But just to contrast these side by side, I'll give you a moment just to take notes on this or to assess the differences. Now, you may be asking yourself, why is this important? Why would I start with philosophy? Well, the night of the Epiphany, the night that Dr. Stewart showed up in my office at 2 a.m., it really hit me that everything is based on this, that whatever I believed had one of these origins to it. So sometimes in the course of graduate work, when I had depression or anxiety, just concerns about finishing the program and so on, I would break down the anxiety that I had and ask myself, where does this come from? Is this sensory data that I'm getting? Is it just my own self-doubt? Or is this just not my calling? Should I not be doing this work in the first place? So one of the things I'd like to start with for you folks that are processing this for your own lives right now is to write down what your anxiety is about, what your trauma is about, what your stressors are about, and then ask yourself, are these things based in observable data? Are they basically from the mind or thought life, or do they challenge your own deep convictions about yourself? Let me just give an example from law enforcement specifically. If you have multiple officers respond to a fatal traffic scene, for example, one of the people that's involved, one of the officers, may be keen on five senses. They may be looking for scientific data. They're looking for evidence of the crash. They're looking for skid marks. They're starting to put cones out that explain different data. They're taking pictures. They're trying to document factual sensory data so that can be used in court. A second officer may show up on the scene, and they are immediately looking for the logical, what happened here? Was there ice on the road? Was there alcohol involved? And they're trying to think through the process. They're not as concerned about the sensory data that they pick up. They're starting to interpret, this is probably what happened. This is what we know. This is what the driver might have been thinking. And they approach the traffic scene with a much different mindset than the first person. The third person who shows up may be existential in nature, and they may thrive on the excitement of a traffic fatality. They may get excited about having a story to share. They may have excitement about seeing for the first time bodies on the road. They may have a very different individual reaction to this. On the other hand, the existential person may show up and feel tremendous sympathy for the loss of life. They may picture the children in the car, or the fact that somebody lost a brother or mother, father, etc. And their reactions to the traffic scene might be existential in nature, that they feel a tremendous burden in their heart, a sadness that's beyond just grief, but it's a realization that real lives have been lost and other lives have been affected by the accident. So that person responds existentially, again, either positively with excitement, with the thrill of being an EMT or a paramedic, and another person existentially may respond with heartbrokenness. Now, I want to spend a minute with this, and I wasn't sure where to plug this in, but I want to talk with you just a little bit about this existential response, because I'm guessing, again, in the audience, if you have any experience in the field, that you've dealt with numerous anxieties. You've dealt with the first time you saw death. You've dealt with children. You've dealt with crimes against people. You've seen some pretty horrible slides. You may have been on scene for some pretty horrible things to witness, what has happened in the house, the speculation about how people were murdered, et cetera, et cetera. So my guess is that many people in the audience have had those experiences and have found a way to cope with those, whether it's the dark humor that gets used, whether it's just the camaraderie, whether it's taking a break from the scene and stepping outside. But I want to touch for just a moment on an existential reaction to crime scenes. And that would be when a person feels like, excuse my profanity here, but why in the hell did I choose a career where this is what I do? And should I continue doing this? And this is over my head. This makes me so sad. This is so hard for me. And the traditional coping mechanisms, perhaps going home and having a beer or working out or stopping by a friend's house, the traditional ways of dealing with existential angst or existential despair in these situations, it doesn't work. And so in my office, I typically do not see first responders who have the common anxiety of just responding to a given scene. It's typically not that there's something new about it that bothers them. People that come to see me most often are those who have had an existential experience that they did not expect. Without going into too much detail, I'll just describe for you that here in Colorado, in a very rural area, a grandmother was robbed in her home, and following that, she was sexually assaulted and killed, and probably killed before she was sexually assaulted. I would guess that 6 or 7 different agencies responded to that crime scene. And from that, I think 5 or so different people came to see me because of the horror, the existential reaction that they had. To be somewhat crass about it, the first responders would say, if you want to rob somebody, okay, we get that. You need money for drugs. Come into the house and take jewelry. But do not touch this person. Do not do what you did. This crosses every moral boundary that is imaginable. And so this is where people existentially respond with a hatred, with a sadness, with a profound sense that what if this happened to my grandmother, et cetera, et cetera. And this is what can drive a person really out of the field. And this is what I see in my office too often. So that was the philosophical foundation. And again, I could apply this to almost any situation that you could describe to me. We would break it down into sensory data, to cognitive data, to existential data, and examine it from there. This whole train of thought, this whole idea of helping other people took on a new momentum when I studied the human brain and realized that it really conformed to what I'd been taught from Dr. Stewart philosophically, that the 2 hemispheres of the brain function differently. The left side of the brain is designed for the sensory data. It's designed for physical manipulation of the limbs. It's designed for seeing, hearing, all of those sensory data goes to the left brain, as does cognitive information that makes sense to us. When someone gives us a sentence, I bought a new puppy today, that sentence given, it just makes sense to us. It's logical. There's no reason for us to question that. The left brain is what takes that data and it archives it, much like a PO box system or a library where information that comes in is stored in the left brain. It doesn't have emotional content to it. It's more or less just factual information. Yes, I understand that. Yes, I get it. And I can remember what you told me. We live in a culture where this is highly valued. And in fact, in law enforcement and many agencies, this is the culture of the agency, is factual information. It's similar to the military in that you don't have emotions. You're not allowed to have emotions. You don't show much excitement. You don't show much despair. You don't show anxiety. You don't show trauma. You basically take information and take it logically. And so a whole culture, a whole agency can be programmed to examine life, not just through sensory data, but through logical data, and it makes sense. And of course, when you're dealing with the legal system, then logic is a strong advocate for truth and for justice. And so obviously those things are meaningful, as is sensory data, because we like to collect the smoking gun and the bullet casings and so on. We like to collect that information. And so just by nature of the field that you're in, you're being driven towards left brain, left brain, left brain, fact finding and fact sharing and writing this in reports and presenting data and going to court and doing your slideshow. And most of that, almost exclusively, is left brain information. The right brain then gets ignored, and this is where emotions are. The person, if you look at the top of the screen, they have humor and joy, compassion, empathy, love. They have very positive emotions, and most of us have a fair amount of those, that we do tell jokes every day. We have compassion for other people. We certainly are capable of loving other people. And then we have some emotions that are less likely to be shared. If we're lonely, if we're frustrated, if we're discouraged, oftentimes those emotions tend to be withheld a little bit more. We don't share them quite as frequently. We certainly don't share them socially. We share them with a smaller number of people. If you look at that blue area on the slide, I'm just going to make a mark here that will demonstrate something that is important. If I were to fill in this line here, what I refer to as the shelf, and underneath the shelf go those emotions that are not socially acceptable, and sometimes they're not acceptable for us to share even with people close to us. So we hide those emotions. We put them underneath the shelf, and we tell ourselves, I will deal with this later. So underneath that shelf goes these words that you see that are being ashamed, being inadequate, being grief-stricken, being overwhelmed with the scene. So if you can imagine responding to a car accident or a burglary or some violent action that happens, and your gut reaction is not sensory data, you're not collected evidence for court, you're not trying to make sense out of what happened, but you are emotionally moved by what happened. You are struck by it. You are overwhelmed by that. You cannot typically share those emotions on scene with other officers, with other crime scene investigators. I work with social workers who have this experience. And so we just take those emotions and we just try to put on a cover, or put on a face, pretend as though it doesn't matter to us, but they go underneath that shelf and we start storing up emotions or experiences that have never been shared. I'm guessing that many of you in the audience have spoken to or been intimate in conversation with war veterans, and when you ask them about their experiences, they can share part of it. Oftentimes, soldiers returning from war, they might share something funny that happened. They might share a camaraderie, a brotherhood. They might share some things about the military that were enjoyable. But when it comes to the dirty work of war, those things are often protected because the person doesn't want to have a bad response. They don't want somebody to trivialize it or minimize it. And they don't want to share an existential despair that somebody else cannot comprehend. And so that's what goes underneath the shelf. So my biggest concern in doing a training like this or speaking to people like you is that you are aware of the emotions that you have that have never been shared, especially when you're in a culture which discourages that or minimizes that or makes fun of it or sees a person as weak. It's a complete juxtaposition of an agency that says we care about ourselves, we care about our brotherhood, and yet when a person has these emotions, these existential experiences of hopelessness or grief, or should I continue to do this work, oftentimes they are still shamed or left out. So peer support groups and having a psychologist on staff, those are attempts to kind of minimize this and normalize that sometimes feelings of inadequacy, shame or guilt, those come into play. So I put that line up there specifically for those of you that are doing any kind of self-examination during this talk. What have you hidden? What is down there that nobody knows about? What have you experienced that is so powerful for you that it shapes your decision-making, and yet it's never been shared with somebody? And those are the folks that have come to my office, and I take a special satisfaction in helping them put that into words. And while we're on the left brain, right brain, let me just say this to you, that when you're on the right side of the brain, as we see on the slide now, vocabulary words are on the left side. And so when we have emotions like this, the right brain typically does not have vocabulary words. They have to go seek them. And so if you can imagine neurological wires going from the right brain to the left brain through the corpus callosum. They're searching for words. And I don't mean this to be in any way discriminatory, but men typically separate those two halves of the brain, and they tend to stay in the left brain. And so they when they have emotions, they don't have a way of accessing words for that. So I found this to be true, again, without painting a too broad of a picture, that when men have emotions, they typically don't have words for those emotions until it's anger, and that comes out physically. It comes out with aggression, as opposed to other words of aggression, such as I'm disappointed, I'm hurt, I'm frustrated by this, I feel ticked off. They typically don't have words like that. They hold it in until it becomes explosive. Women, on the other hand, by and large, women can access emotions. They can work on both halves of both hemispheres simultaneously. And by and large, the women that I've seen in my office have far less difficulty identifying a whole variety of emotions. And it's really, it's typically a joy to work with women because they access the emotions so easily. I enjoy work with men because to watch them learn how to do that, to build that bridge between the two hemispheres, is also incredibly rewarding. If you're familiar with the book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, the basic premise of that book is that men are left-brained and women are right-brained. That's the basic gist of this. And in general, looking at a scene, if you took traditional gender responses, men typically would look at an accident and look at the kind of car it was and the kind of damage it was and those kinds of things, where a woman might first of all look at relational experiences and who's involved and that there are real people involved. And again, I don't want to be too generic, and I don't mean to be discriminatory about that. But in general, at a car that got to me was when Dr. Stewart described the sensory data, the empirical data, and the rational data, is that those are primarily left brain information that we store, with the exception of emotions that are also, they're cognitive in the sense that they typically emotions do make sense. Perhaps not on the surface, perhaps not right away, but as I've explored lots of emotions with folks, eventually the emotion that they have has a historical antecedent to it that helps them understand why they react with what they do. And we should get to that here in just a few minutes. The existential pain that a person has, I don't see it in the brain at all. I see it down in this blue category that we've isolated, but I see it deeper in the heart. Well, let me just kind of give you another anecdote. We have an officer who's been in law enforcement for 20 years, feels like he's seen it all, he's done it all, nothing's going to bother him, and he responds to a particular scene. And this is where a trigger goes off in his brain. Why am I doing this kind of work? Why is this what I chose to do? I'm not gifted to do this. And I'll give you a specific example. You have an officer that responds to a active shooter. And so he enters the building alone. He's the first to respond. As he goes down the hallway, he sees a person with a gun. Doesn't know for sure that that's the shooter, but that would be the assumption. However, on the rules of engagement, he can't shoot because the person is not a threat at that moment. The gunman sees the officer, slams the door, fires another shot, and kills another person. Finally, the officer catches up to the suspect and subdues him. It shoots him or arrests him, whatever, and the situation comes to a closure. For the officer, though, did they do what was right? With their sensory data, yes, they observed the suspect. They was not in a threatening position. The sensory data told them don't shoot. The logical information, the left brain information would say, under the rules of engagement, I'm not allowed to do this. This violates company policy. This is not okay. This would be unethical for me to shoot. But existentially, when the suspect shoots a last suspect and kills another person, the officer has this existential grief that they should have shot the suspect when they had the chance. They have a moral dilemma. It's deeper than a moral dilemma. It becomes, who else do I know that works in a field? Who else has a job where they have to make these kinds of decisions? You don't do this cutting hair, giving out bank loans, selling cars, selling insurance. You don't have these kinds of situations. Why am I doing this? And the existential despair that comes from that is really a sense of isolation and internal conflict. So in the case of this officer who does not shoot the suspect prior to the last killing, is faced with a dilemma that's deeper than just logic. You could have 10 people say to him, you did the right thing. You could have 10 people say to him, you should have shot the guy. And he said, if I'd done that, I would have lost my job because I violated the rules of engagement. And so some folks would say, well, shoot the guy and lie about it. Say that he was pointing the gun at you. And he said, well, then I couldn't live with myself. And I couldn't continue to do the work if I'd lied about something so important. And so you see this, not just a dilemma, but a trilemma with a person about what is it that I do. When I look at philosophy, when I look at the brain, when I look at where does this problem occur, it didn't occur to me when I was much younger that you can have a moral dilemma that does not have a right or wrong answer to it. It's a dilemma no matter what. And this is what destroys a person's career. They can't possibly pull their gun at the next scene. They don't want to be a cop anymore. They don't want to be a crime scene investigator because they've seen enough. This one hits too close to home. It's the death of a 2-year-old. I have a 2-year-old at home myself. And something hits with them existentially that I think creates a dilemma. That is, if you don't have the capacity for words, excuse me, if you're not familiar with sharing this with other people, there becomes an isolation, there becomes a loneliness, if you will, that goes on with this, that I think is the beginning of alcoholism and pornography and any other addiction that would take a genuinely good officer or law enforcement personnel of some sort and just turn them into a wreck because they can't talk about what happened, they can't find resolution. And eventually this kind of turmoil becomes the guidance for their life. Everything just feels totally messed up by that. So this is very powerful stuff for me. And when I talk with people who are in this situation, I often will show them these two hemispheres of the brain, especially the right brain, and especially the shelf, and say, once you put things underneath there, you've got to come back and access it at some point. You have to be truthful with yourself, and you have to put that into words. Hopelessness and grief and inadequacy are often mitigated by verbal sharing, and my preference, despite being a psychologist myself, my preference is that people have this with other friends, that they don't turn to mental health because they have such a great support system. That would be ideal, is that we have that either within the department or another officer outside the department or a friend who's got the capacity to do that. Now, in a very paradoxical way, the best people to choose are those who have had similar experiences, perhaps a history of child abuse, perhaps a history of dysfunction in the family, perhaps some other trauma that's happened, is that people who have been underneath that shelf for a period of time and have come out, they recognize the pain that's there, and they're often the best friends to have because they don't judge that. The judgment comes from the left brain. They don't go there. They just come into your own shame and helplessness, and they're there for you. And that's the kind of friendships that really alleviate this kind of thing that happens. I could go on and on about this because it happens in my office so often. I won't keep this up for long. I think people generally know the differences between the right and left brains. This one's a little bit more colorful and shows with a little bit more demonstrative expression the differences in the two brains. My fear for people who are in law enforcement is that they will eventually become left-brained, and all this color that you see on the screen, all this expressiveness, the creativity, the passion, the joy about doing something, the whole beauty of life can be lost when you're immersed in negativity and crime and victims and so on. It can just wipe out all that color, and you end up with kind of both sides of the slide being the same color. Is that life is boring, life is difficult, life is neutral. I don't feel up or down. I just get through it. I've got 8 years, 4 months to retirement. I just want to get through it. And all that color, all that passion about life can get sucked out of a person when their job is to spend day after day looking at slides of child abuse, looking at sexual abuse victims, dealing with the very horrible parts of life. It can just neutralize that. I'm guessing that most of you have seen this if you've taken Psych 101. And on the left side of your screen, if you look at the picture, most people, again, would see this very quickly as either a white vase that's in the foreground with a black background, or if you pull the black forward and you push the white to the back, you see basically two people looking at each other. Now, by show of hands, some of you see both of those. Okay, all right, good. All right, here's the power of this. This is called a Gestalt drawing. The power of this is not just in the cuteness or the cleverness of the artistry. The power of this figure here is that we can change paradigms. We are basically either pushing the white vase to the back and bringing the black faces forward, or pushing the black faces back and bringing the white vase forward. But that's a paradigm shift. That's seeing something with your sensory data, but seeing it from a different angle, seeing it from a different perspective. And that becomes very powerful in terms of dealing with stress. For example, if a person, an officer is on the scene and they have a gun pointed at them and shots are fired at them, in the moment, they have to remain calm, but they get home and have PTSD for maybe a couple of weeks. They can't sleep. They start having these thoughts of what would have happened if I'd been shot. And so they stay awake for several nights in a row just worried about this. The paradigm shift in this, the sensory data, would be that the gun is no longer present. The suspect has been apprehended and they're in jail. I'm not in physical danger at this time. I should be able to sleep. It becomes the mind that has pulled the shooter or the bullets forward, and it has pushed in the background time and space, which is that's no longer a current activity. So it's probably too difficult to explain in this format, but in general what happens then is that person has elevated the fear of the bullets being fired at them instead of putting that in the background that situation is over. I don't think I'm explaining this as well as I'd like to, but the whole point of this is that you can take an experience that you've had and you can see it differently. And so I want to make sure that I foster that in those of you that are listening, that you want to be able to change how you look at whatever happens to you from a different perspective. That's crucial to mental health, is that I can see it from somebody else's perspective. And so if you go back and forth with the vase and the two faces, you're learning how to do that. Then you apply that to a situation, for example, not paying a bill on time or having a breakup in a relationship, or there's so many other applications where you can reverse it, see it differently, not because the new way is better, but because it gives you mental health, that you're not stuck in looking at your life from one perspective only. It gives you a malleability or a flexibility in your thinking, stop and see things differently. So if your pet dies, if you're going through a divorce, if you have financial difficulties, if you've had several bad things happen in a row, to be able to stop and push those to the background and bring forward feelings of gratitude or I'm healthy, those kinds of things. If you're able to do that, it's a true sign of mental health to be able to do that in the moment. This one's a little bit more complicated. I'll give you just a moment to see if you can identify both the young woman and the old woman. This one typically gives people a little bit more pause. If you see both, just raise your hands. No, I can't see it. Never mind. Okay, I'll move on. If you see the old woman, this is her eye, this is her nose, and this is her mouth. If you see a young woman, she's actually looking away. This would be her eye looking in this direction. This is her nose, her chin, and she's got a necklace around here with a bonnet on. So the young woman is looking this direction, and the old woman, I think, is more prominent. You can see her mouth and her eyes, etc. A little bit more Freud in here with the same basic principle. Can you see both? Can you see Freud himself in the picture, and can you see his dependence on his mother? That's also hidden in the picture. I'm aware of the time. I want to touch base. I want to make sure that you follow me, that we're going to just touch on a couple of these that are left brain effects, psychological damage that occurs to the left brain. So this interrupts our thinking process. And the cognitive processes are typically more grounded. They're more permanent. They tend to last longer. They tend to be more strongly held, is when things are in the left brain. When you believe something to be true, then sometimes sensory data or time or the ability to go back and forth, as we just did with the Gestalt pictures, sometimes that gets lost. Let me just cover a couple of these, and I'll try to keep myself on track with getting to further slides. The attribution theory is basically what is also called your explanatory system. So when something happens, let's just say that there's a departmental policy, and your attribution when something goes wrong is to blame the agency, blame the supervisor, blame the sheriff or the police chief, blame the crime lab director. Our attributions become important. And one of the things that happens to the left brain, and this can happen over a period of several years and very likely over 20 or 25 years in a career, is that we end up with an attribution that is false. We blame other people. We're so used to just saying it's the higher ups, it's the people who are behind the desks that create the problems, it's the agency, it's the day shift, it's this or that. If you want to clean up your own mental health, if you want to be honest about that, I've asked patients and I've asked people in the trainings, write down 4 or 5 of your issues. And after that, write down an attribution, a reason for that issue that is based on you, not based on the other person, not based on circumstances. What is it that you do that keeps that a problem? It's a very powerful self-examination tool for psychological health, is that I don't get into the habit of having things go wrong and blaming other people or having false attributions that it's because of these external things that happen. When I'm honest with myself, I say, here are my problems. Here's what I've done to cause these problems or perpetuate these problems. What is it that I'm doing? That's a very healthy process to engage in that can be very helpful to you. Skip down to learned helplessness. It's difficult to describe this in words without a diagram, but basically learned helplessness is when they put a dog into a laboratory and there's a short wall between the two halves of the laboratory, and they turn a light bulb on the top of the wall, and 10 seconds later they shock the part of the floor that the dog is standing on. Well, after a short period of time, the dog learns that the light that goes off is a warning that they're about to be shocked, and so most breeds of dogs learn then to jump the wall the moment that they see the light come on. This is how you avoid shocks. Well, this is the basic concept of learning. Your warning light is that you're going to be tested on Friday. If you don't study, if you just stand there and you don't do your work, you're going to get the shock when you get the tests and you get the results and you fail the class. If you're smart and you hear the warning, test on Friday, then you jump early, you study, you prepare for that, so that when the test actually comes, you're not shocked by it, you're prepared for it. That's the essence of learning, whether it's catching a ball or writing a paper or succeeding at anything. Learning basically has avoiding the negative consequence and pursuing the positive consequence. However, in learned helplessness, graduate students in psychology, being the sick people that they are, decided to trick the dog and shock both sides. That when the dog jumped, he would be shocked regardless of what happened. So that term learned helplessness just means that. The dog isn't naturally helpless. They've been taught to be helpless. They've been taught that they're damned if they do, they're damned if they don't. There's no use doing this. What's the point? And so an officer or a person in law enforcement might apply for a promotion and be turned down. They might have suggestions about making the department better, and they get turned down. So they're being shocked whether they say something or they don't, and eventually they fall into this left brain logical thinking that says no matter what I do, I'm not going to be appreciated, I'm not going to be advanced, I'm not one of the good old boys, et cetera, et cetera. And learned helplessness is when we just give up and say, no matter what I do, it won't make a difference. There's certainly a place in life for that to happen. There's certainly a place to accept that situations are out of our control. But by and large, if you examine yourself and say, have I done this? Have I given up too quickly? Have I had bad results no matter what I do? And that has become my conclusion. That's my philosophy. It's an existential despair that no matter what I do, there's no good result. That becomes a permanent state for people. That's where the left brain believes that, sometimes for 20 years. So in patients that I've seen that have perhaps sexual abuse in their history, and they draw a conclusion about that, they are at fault, or they're poor sexual partners from here on, or they're dirty, or any other conclusion that they might come to, learned helplessness is that they have believed that. And sometimes in my office, the person has believed that for many, many years. And it's terribly unfortunate to watch that happen. I'll touch on burnout and compassion fatigue probably at another time, but negativity and complaining is another big one, is that you just get in the habit of not seeing the good in the agency, but just seeing that, the person leaves the patrol car dirty, or people don't pick up on your ideas, or things are not handled the way that you'd like them to be, and becoming negative and complaining. Once a person becomes that, when I've done trainings at agencies over the years, it's the same person that's negative and complaining year after year. It typically doesn't change. And so doing a psychological survival is that you might ask somebody, do you see me as a negative person? And if all you do is come home to your significant other and bitch about the work that you do and never talk about the awesomeness of serving the community, bringing justice, responding to victims, helping people, if that's not part of your vocabulary anymore, negativity and complaining become kind of the root of your existence with work. I'm going to skip over this slide, which just kind of covered that. Let me just touch on cognitive dissonance for just a moment. And I'll just let you read through the slide first. Cognitive dissonance is essentially the premise that you hold two competing thoughts at the same time, and one of them has to win. And so if you believe you are a good crime scene investigator, firefighter, paramedic, cop, whatever your training is, you feel like at some point, if you're good enough, you can prevent or you can not make a significant mistake. And so the idea would be that if you're a good cop, that nobody that's in your group will be shot at or injured, that things will be done so well that the proper procedures are used, that no officer will be shot and killed, that nothing bad will happen. Unfortunately, when you do this work for a long period of time, there are negative consequences. There are bad outcomes that happen. And if that challenges a person's deepest thought that I'm a bad cop because I didn't do this, or we should have prevented this, you end up in a situation where it's as if you expected everything to be perfect with the job that you're doing. I worked with a surgeon years ago who came in because a patient had died, and we eventually got to the point where we talked about if you're doing surgery, if you're doing brain surgery or heart surgery or any kind of surgery, the risk of somebody dying on the table is significant. It's there. It may be a small number, but it's significant when it happens. And he had never prepared himself for failure. Obviously, he was very bright. He was at the top of his class. He was always extolled for his intellect, and now a patient died. That challenged his whole belief system that he was that smart or that good, and perhaps people had been wrong all these years to see him that way because a good surgeon doesn't let a patient die. The same thing happens with cops, or with crime scene investigators. We should have picked up on this. Or perhaps you testify in court and the cross-examining attorney finds some weakness in your argument and you just blame yourself because you should have known that. So just to return to the idea of learned helplessness, I just got back from a vacation, and probably the week or two prior, I could feel myself losing interest in my patients, fatigue, compassion fatigue. I can't wait for the hour to be over. I can't wait for the day to be done. I can't wait to get home. I'm just burned out. I need a vacation. I could feel that for a couple of weeks. And I shared it with a couple of patients, more as a joke that they weren't going to get the best out of me that day. But in general, I could feel it diminishing. I want to ask you, when you feel that way, when you're discouraged about your work, when you've run too many cases back to back, what is it that will restore you? And to my surprise, many people don't even identify this is the best thing for me. The things that I have heard have been, I get on my motorcycle and I go for a long ride. I spend time with my children. I go to the spa, I get a manicure, I get a massage, etc. But you need to know what it is that helps you recover. I happen to like a lot of adventure vacations, and so I do a lot of things that completely absorb me when I'm out of the office. I do not think about patients or work or finances or any of the things that go along with my business. I think entirely about the place that I'm at. So I hope that you can find something that brings that to you. If you're a person who needs praise, I hope you've got people who praise you. If it's just time off and you stay home and read or paint the house or whatever you do, I hope you'll find something that restores you. It's essential to psychological health to have that and to know what that is so you can turn to it quickly. I want to talk a little bit about the right brain and more problems that I see in working with folks. They're not left-brain, logically based. Certainly, there are cognitive distortions. Certainly, people think in negative ways, but primarily what I see in my office are exposure to trauma that results in emotional disruption. And the number one aspect of that, if you're looking at panic attacks, if you're looking at sleeplessness, if you're looking at changes in diet, if you're looking at PTSD, these are all part of the anxiety category of psychological disturbance. I want to take just a couple minutes and talk about anxiety with you. This is a picture of my daughter. I gave both my kids a skydiving gift certificate several years ago for Christmas. And when the weather warmed up, they called me and asked me to go with them. And she paid for a cameraman to come along, and he got this snapshot of her with her instructor, and that smile lasted for about a week afterwards. But to my surprise, neither of my kids was nervous about skydiving. And when we finally landed and went out for lunch afterwards, I asked them why. And to my great deep satisfaction, they told me that I had exposed them to lots of anxious situations over the years that they trusted. Things we had been rappelling and climbing and doing 14ers and rafting rapids and so on. So that I got to see the results that when the kids were faced with a anxious situation, they felt like they had some ways to master that. So truly a blessing for me to watch that happen. The descriptors that I have on the screen here are probably not what's important. What is important is that you recognize when this happens to you as a result of your work, actually any time, but specifically with work. What makes you anxious? I've been doing therapy for 30 plus years, and I very seldom get anxious about whoever comes in the office, whatever the issue is. I've done enough where I feel comfortable with almost anything. However, if a patient walked into the office and they just seem to intimidate me, or they seem to have an issue that was maybe it required emergency medical care, maybe the person needed to be hospitalized. If I get anxious in my office, I want to pay attention to my body, to my own anxiety, not just focus on the patient and what am I going to do, but to recognize that I just got traumatized by this. I just got anxious about this. And I've done enough things in my life that created pretty anxious situations. I've responded to some critical incidents on scene. So I do know what anxiety is in my own body. So I want to ask you, do you pay attention enough to your body to know when this happens? When your stomach shrinks up, when your heart rate goes up, when you start to sweat, when you have racing thoughts? Do you pay attention to your own body? Because you may not be able to stop it in the moment. You may have to continue doing your job, so to speak, or finish the traffic scene or finish the investigation. But to note that that has happened is critical. And I think one of the things that I've really enjoyed in my personal life that comes from my profession is that I do recognize much more when I'm anxious, and I can make better choices about how to deal with that. So it helped me with disciplining the kids and not do it with anxiety. It's helped me to do public speaking. It's helped me to take bigger risks, both in the office and out of the office, because I can manage the anxiety better. I got some pictures that made me anxious when I just looked at them online. And I don't know if these are real or not, but when I saw it, my stomach just shrunk. I could feel it. And that's kind of what I wanted the audience to do is when you see this, do you feel anxiety? Can you sense it somewhere in your body? I don't know if this is photoshopped. It just looks like something crazy kids would do. But it made me nervous when I thought about that, of both stuff that I've done in the past and what kids do these days to challenge themselves. So I don't know if this makes your stomach turn or makes you anxious just by looking at the screen. It did mine when I was just looking through pictures on the screen. This is a true picture that was taken by a friend of mine when we did the Grand Canyon. And I just love that rapid, but it brings back the fight, flight, or swim that most people in the audience have been subjected to before. But stress can be a good thing. It can motivate you to study for a test or do your best or work out harder, whatever it is. You stress. There is good stress in life. We have to recognize that. But go back to the top of that screen. You'll see that creates a physiological reaction. One of the differences that is important for me to note today is that anxiety, which is cognitive in nature, oh, I should be careful. There's some flashing lights up ahead. It's starting to snow heavily. I can be anxious about things and just make a simple adjustment in my life, and the anxiety is dealt with. However, if my body gets involved, if the car starts to slide, if I tighten up the steering wheel because I'm upset with traffic, if I'm clenching my jaw, if I'm making a fist in an argument with somebody, I try to pay attention to my physiology, not just the cognitive part. Cognitive anxiety that's fine. I can just dismiss it or retreat from it, whatever I have to do. But physiologically, I want people in the field of first responders as en masse. I want people to recognize that when their physiology changes, that's a clear indicator of significant stress. So most people are familiar with fight, flight, or freeze, that the person tends to run away, engage in a fight, conquer the foe, or just to freeze up and not know what to do. Stress can be low grade. This would be my concern for this audience as well, that you just collectively keep picking up stressors in your life and things that you'd like to avoid. Probably the most common thing is for law enforcement officers to face the doorway of a restaurant. That's a low grade stress that it's hard for them to sit any differently. And it's almost a joke among first responders that they have to face the door. They have to be hypervigilant, even in a restaurant where they could shut that trade off. You can't do that. So you have acute stress and PTSD. I don't know how much time I'll have to get into both of these, but acute stress is when that physiology changes in a heartbeat. The car starts to skid. You have a call over the radio. You're asked to go to a crime scene, and it's much worse than you anticipated, or it hits home because it's a neighborhood close to you. Some of the smaller communities around Greeley where I live, I've done a lot of debriefings with volunteer fire departments, and the person that they responded to was somebody that they knew. Sometimes it's a child that played baseball with their own child or had spent the night at their house in the past week or so. And so the acute stress is when it's kind of an oh shit moment that this is not what I expected. So you respond to domestic violence and you expect it to be a verbal conflict and maybe some pushing, but you get inside and you realize there's weapons involved, or there's intensity, or you don't have enough manpower to handle this. That's an acute stress. It's important to pay attention to when your body changes with that. I wish I had more time to get into the PTSD, but basically PTSD is a delayed response. So in the moment, the person stays cool, calm, and collected, and they look as though they're responding to the situation with the left brain. They're making good decisions. They're following policy. They're keeping people safe. They're collecting data that's important for the investigation. They look like everything's okay, but it's afterwards that the right brain screams out for attention. Hey, you buried these emotions. You felt this way. Now you're home alone. Why isn't there anybody here for me now when I'm crying or sad or in a fetal position or drinking way too much alcohol or playing video games well into the night where it's going to affect my work tomorrow, not speaking to the spouse, being too upset with the children, those kinds of things. PTSD has lots of effects, and I love talking about it. I don't have as much time today as I'd like to. So let's just very quickly here take a look at the different types of anxiety. You can have empirical anxiety, that there's actually a snake in the room or a snake on the trail, and that would be a real anxiety that is empirically based. It's right there in front of me. Most folks do not have an issue with empirical anxiety. If it's a real thing and the response is accurate, they're afraid of falling off the building or falling off the edge of a rock cliff. Most empirical anxiety are not the things that cause issues for people. The rational anxiety, a fear of failure. What if I fail this test? My whole career will be changed. My whole life will be changed. So fear of failure can definitely affect a person deeply. And then just again to touch on this I mentioned earlier, an existential anxiety is when a person responds to a scene. For example, an officer responded to a chase, and it was a 16-year-old suspect who was firing his gun, and he was third or fourth in the scene. And he pulled his weapon, had it pointed towards the 16-year-old, and when the whole situation broke down, he realized that the suspect was his nephew. And when he came to see me, he said, I don't know that I could ever pull my weapon again because it's somebody's nephew. And had I shot him, I could have never lived with myself. And from that, he extrapolated that every young man is somebody's nephew, somebody's son, etc. So the existential anxiety was enough to paralyze him where he didn't feel like he could do law enforcement anymore. And so the cure for that, of course, is getting him back to the range and basically walking back to the fact that statistically, empirically, it's very unlikely he would ever have a family member at the end of his gun again. And that if he was called for this, if that was his calling in life was to be an officer, then learning to use his gun in a critical situation was imperative for him. So again, the existential despair is what I want to make sure the audience today gets. I think that might be new to you, and that is I don't want to have a critical incident take my career and put it down the tubes because I'm drinking more, because I'm not sleeping, because I'm more irritable at home. I've gone through a couple of marriages. I've been too difficult on the kids. I've had social services to my home for how I discipline, those kinds of things. I don't want existential trauma to come home with a person and change their career. We have to understand it. We have to be able to talk about it. We have to be able to seek help for it. I'm going to just take a few more minutes, and then we'll take time for a Q&A. But this is a slide that kind of summarizes some of the ways to deal with it. You want to have psychological survival. If you want to stay in your career for the full tenure and get through it all, let's just go through this slide together. I recognize that stress can be chronic, low grade. It can happen for a long period of time, or it can be a sudden, acute incident like I just mentioned. I'm familiar with the fight, flight, or freeze response by my body. I know what my body does under stress, and I can deal with that. I can get my body back under my control as soon as possible. So even if I feel like fighting or fleeing or freezing, I'm aware of what my body does, and I can address those issues physiologically. A hot-firing person is somebody who responds on the scene from the right brain. All that color that you saw in the earlier slide is a hot-firing person. We kind of expect this from civilians, that when we respond to a horrible situation, perhaps a house fire or something like that, we expect them to have a lot of passion, yelling, shouting, feeling nervous, maybe yelling at the cops, that kind of thing. We expect people to hot fire. But we expect cops and law enforcement and crime scene investigators, et cetera, to cold fire. That when they arrive on scene, they don't have any emotion. They respond with the left brain. They analyze data. They collect data. They're looking for justice. They're looking for causation, and they really don't have any emotion at all. The problem with the hot and cold firing is that people who cold fire on scene, people who look like just fantastic officers, will often hot fire when they get home. In other words, the other side of the brain says, I want my chance too. Holy shit, I almost got shot. I can't believe what happened. I'll never get that scene out of my mind. It's those kinds of things where a cop or a first responder of any type can hot fire at home, and what this does is intensifies an emotion. So the example I often use is coming home to a 15-year-old who's asleep in bed when I get home at 2 a.m, but he was told to cut the grass. And when I pulled up in the driveway, I could see the grass wasn't cut. And I'm angry enough to go wake him up, grab him by the shoulder blades and pull him out of bed and yell at him for not cutting the grass. Not because the grass is that important to me, but because I've been traumatized on the job. I'm hot firing at home. I'm taking out all that adrenaline that was going on once I'm back inside my home and I'm safe. It's horrible for the family. It's horrible for people who live with that person, but that's what's happening to that. I'm going to finish with this. I've got plenty more here. I wish I had another hour and a half. But the 3 B's of controlling your body is when I have stress, when I have acute stress, when I'm aware of stress, there are ways to turn this off. And they're referred to, I call them the 3 B's. I want to get to one more slide here. These are your adrenal glands, and they're on top of your kidneys. There's 2 of them. I liken them to 2 cans of Red Bull, in that when I am either chronically stressed over a long enough period of time or acutely stressed in the moment, the adrenal glands produce adrenaline, which is a hormone, and that goes in the bloodstream, and so it changes the entire body. So my legs have blood with adrenaline in it, my arms, my brain, my heart, my respiratory system, everything that is facilitated with blood has got adrenaline in it, and so it changes the entire body. The way to reduce the adrenaline, and this goes back to Pavlov, which we had to skip over, is the way to make the adrenal glands stop producing is the 3 B's. And that is, if you check your body, you relax your body, and you do a progressive muscle relaxation, which means from head to toe or from toe to head. I ask myself, is there any body part that's showing tension? Do I have a clenched jaw, a clenched fist? Have I got my legs too tight together? Am I wrapping my arms around myself? Am I in a fetal position? Is my body showing me something that has evidence of anxiety? That's the first thing. So total body relaxation, and especially at bedtime, this is where it's very helpful. You can lay in bed and tighten up different groups of muscles and then relax them until you can tell that you're completely at ease. The second thing is to take these slow, deep breaths that most people have learned as well, and that is if the respiratory system slows down, everything inside the chest, the thoracic region, has to slow down too. So when you slow the breathing down, the heart rate goes down, the adrenaline goes down, digestion goes down, everything responds to breathing. So you want to make sure that you learn how to breathe when you're anxious, and if you hot fire at home, then that's when you're doing your breathing as well. You don't have to respond poorly to people. And thirdly, the brain, and that is the hardest part. But when I walk into my bedroom at night, it's not without a plan. I don't just lay down and let whatever thoughts come, whatever trauma is in my mind. I have a planned program for when I go to bed. I'm going to think about this. Here's my next vacation. Here's some place that I went. Here's the look in my child's face. Here's something very pleasant for me. And so when I walk in the bedroom at night, it's not an open forum for whatever thought comes to me. I'm already directing those thoughts. Let's go back and repeat that backpacking trip. Let's go find that fishing hole. Let's do this river again. Let's remember this conversation. Let's remember something that was very pleasant. And so planning the brain is powerful for this. Okay, I'm going to stop there. We've got 12 or 13 minutes for questions, and I'm happy to do what I can to be helpful.
Dr. Christiansen, we have not received any questions yet, so you are more than welcome to go through a few more slides if you would like while we let the audience type in any questions they might have.
Sure. I've got another hour's worth, so I'll try to do that in a summation. If you want to have psychological survival, you have got to protect your sleep. And when we talk about sleep hygiene, it's not about the cleanliness of the body or the cleanliness of the sheets and pillows. It's really about, does your bedroom invite a quietness? And so making the bed and putting clothes away and keeping the bedroom somewhat attractive is good psychologically because it's a place of comfort. That gives the whole aura. You've probably heard the term feng shui. In Scandinavia, it's called hygge, and that is that my bedroom should be a place that invites me to relax. And so oftentimes it's recommended that we only use the bedroom for sleeping and sex, but not for paying bills, not for watching TV, not for just moping about life or being depressed, but the bedroom becomes a special sacred place. So the slide that I have up is humorous. I wish I had a bedroom like that. It would probably stop the sleepwalking, but that'd be great. I do pay attention to my bedroom, not that it can't be a mess, but if I'm under stress, then I make sure that the bedroom is inviting and a safe place for me to go and unwind. If this is how you go to sleep at night, it's good to change that. Again, it's a poor habit to have. It's poor sleep. So, how's your bedroom? Comfortable, safe place, good place to be, relaxing to you. Let's just talk for just a moment about the sleep cycle. I'll give you a chance to read this slide and we'll move on. The slide that you have there is the ideal sleep cycle. If we put at the far left hand a time period, let's just say 10 p.m., within the next 90 minutes, the person should be in REM sleep at some point. You see the little part where I put the REM sleep in there. It's random, but the first cycle has REM sleep within it. So from about 10 o'clock to 11:30, I've gotten one REM cycle. As you see, as it circles back towards the level of consciousness, I'm almost awake. So I might hear The kids come in, I might turn off the light, I might get up and use the bathroom, I might adjust the blankets for comfort, but I'm almost awake. A person who's mentally healthy, who's psychologically sound, goes right back into deep sleep again. 90 minutes later, approximately, they're back up to almost being conscious. So again, they adjust the covers, they use the bathroom, whatever. A person who's anxious, a person who has PTSD, when they get to that line, they go above it. They become conscious. They're up watching TV. They're fixing something to eat. They're pacing. They're doing something that is detrimental to the whole sleep cycle process. If you count the rings there, you've got 5 REM cycles. I've dealt with numerous first responders who get down to 3 REM cycles per night for maybe a week in a row. And the REM cycles are important for restoring mental health. Without them, we are more prone to irrational thinking, to even hallucinations. It's a contributor to weight gain. It's a huge factor in depression and anxiety because we don't know why REM sleep is important, but getting 5 cycles of REM sleep seems to be critical for people to recover and be psychologically healthy. As I've gotten older, those 5 cycles become more and more important to me. Of course, in college, I could get by with 2 or 3 for several nights during finals week. But as I've gotten older, those 5 cycles become pretty critical to me that I get all of those. Energy drinks are the enemy of trauma. They're the enemy of anxiety. They are basically a chemical stimulant, much like adrenaline. People who are already traumatized or who have an anxiety arousal, who've got adrenaline flowing through their system, basically adding energy drinks to this is a horrible choice. I don't mean to preach or get on a high horse, but if this is what it takes for you to stay awake, you're not getting the REM sleep. I understand shift work is hard. I understand that you can put in a 20-hour day, maybe several in a row. I understand that. But energy drinks are not the answer for that. They really throw off the entire auto-regulatory system, and they essentially create far more harm than good. Probably not a bad idea to have one once in a while, but if this is part of your daily routine, I think you're jacking up a system that should be dealt with more neutrally, more naturally, more organically, if you will, that you want to be careful with this stuff. This is the income that comes from these different companies. 5-Hour Energy, you see at 1.1 billion, Red Bull 3.4 billion, Monster drinks. So somebody is selling a lot of adrenaline to people who apparently need energy. And again, I think if you're not taking care of your body the way that you should, these become your drug of choice. From the slides that I've shown you already, I would say anxiety is the precipitant to addiction. Once a person is anxious, they try to find a response that comforts that, whether it's looking at pornography or any other form of addiction, whether it's cigarettes or alcohol or maybe drug use. But in general, I would say addictions are an outcome of anxiety that's not been dealt with. They're driven by what's underneath the shelf. They're driven by a sense of insecurity and inadequacy. The term neurotic doesn't get used much anymore, but neurotic refers to an antidote that actually makes the problem worse. So a person who smokes because they're anxious eventually becomes anxious about their smoking. So it becomes cyclical. It doubles down on the anxiety. It may solve the problem in the short run, but it makes it worse in the long run. So again, be careful of anxiety and what your body's doing, and then be careful of how you're addressing that. You can't create an existential despair and treat that with chemicals. You can't put more Red Bull in to make it better. You can't take a medication for existential despair. You have to do that spiritually. You have to do it with examination. I think I'll skip ahead to what I think is one of my last slides. A little bit of humor before I finish. And the reason I put that in there is because Typically, in agencies like this, if we suspect that somebody's misusing alcohol, it's still seen in a humorous way. It's not taken seriously. And so I found a couple slides that really make fun of alcoholism because that's typically how we deal with it initially, rather than confronting it. So we find out that an officer is dysfunctional because of alcohol, but we should have known it much sooner.
Dr. Christiansen, we did have a question that came in.
Sure.
All right, so they're asking, how does the angst of knowing that statistically perpetrators of sexual violence are not indicted or convicted play a role in officers' right brain, left brain burnout?
Repeat that to me one more time, Josh.
How does the angst of knowing that statistically perpetrators of sexual violence are not indicted or convicted play a role in an officer's right brain, left brain burnout?
Wow. Powerful question. Powerful. I would say a couple things about that is that if the officer takes that as discouraging and it's not worth arresting, it's not worth pursuing, that's where cynicism or a false attribution would come in. So you want to protect against that. I think to bemoan the fact that statistically that's the case, to have conferences, to have seminars or training on how to improve the statistics in our favor, so to speak, that would be another way of dealing with this. But in essence, deep down, at the deepest existential level, I realize that life is messed up and I'm not in control of that. I'm doing the best that I can to survive, to do the right thing. And also, this is critical too, is that if that officer could hear not just me, but 100 other people say, thank you for still doing the work. Thank you for being in there. Here's my emotional gratitude for the emotional pain that you suffer. Let me repair some of your angst with my appreciation, gratitude, love, respect. If the officer can receive that, it does seem to neutralize the angst that goes with it, is that the public believes in you. The public wants you to do this. We're against the laws that protect the perpetrators, all of that. It's not an easy answer, but it's a way of saying, if I'm going to expend this kind of emotional energy and not get results, I certainly have to receive it when people do say thank you, or we do get a conviction, or somebody says thank you for the work that you do. I do hear that. I want to keep my emotional economy at neutral, that when I do something that's awesome, and someone says that was awesome, I do receive that. That's what replenishes the loss that I gave with the emotional output that was given. And I do respect people who are in situations like that where they're doing the right thing and not getting the results that they should.
All right, thank you, Dr. Christiansen. We've got about a minute, so if you want to go ahead and wrap up with some closing thoughts, then we'll close out today's webinar.
All right. I've got the slide up now. These four just happened to pose for me because we were in the conference room together. But if you look at them, I'd say, which cop just got traumatized? And as you can see, they're all wearing uniforms. They all look the same. They have the same facial expression. They all perform their jobs. Metaphorically, one of these officers was just traumatized. And because of the uniform, because of the culture, because of the left brain emphasis, you can't tell which one of these is traumatized. And that officer may not know. Well, I hope as a result of today's training that people, first of all, will recognize when they themselves have been traumatized, and then also become the kind of persons that someone who is traumatized or anxious can come to and be comforted through that. So obviously a lot more here to share. I'm happy to visit agencies and come do the full day training and really try to inoculate people from the despair that comes with some of these things that happen. It's a tough work emotionally, psychologically, and I want to be there for people who struggle. And if we can prepare them ahead of time for what's about to happen, then even better.
Thank you so much, Dr. Christiansen. We did have another comment that came in. please write a book if you have not done so already.
Yeah.
Danielle said she would definitely buy it.
Well, thank you, Danielle. I appreciate that. I am actually have started one on this very stuff, so thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Right, and with that, we're going to go ahead and close up today's webinar. You will see that Dr. Christiansen has put his contact information graciously there on your screen, so please make sure that you do take that down before you leave today, just in case you do have any follow-up questions that you would like to reach out to him directly. He has always been very responsive and willing to help out the community, so thank you, Dr. Christiansen, for all of the time that you've put into your presentation today, as well as all the time you put in with everyone that does reach out.
I hope it's helpful. I'm happy to have feedback of any type through email, Facebook, or phone call. Feel free to contact me. And God bless you all for what you're doing.
All right, and with that, we're going to go ahead and close up. Again, thank you, Dr. Christiansen, for your follow-up webinar today. And then we would obviously like to thank all of our participants for joining. Without your support and participation, we simply would not be able to continue with our live events and our webinars. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. You will see that Julian has posted our links there in the chat pod. If you are not following us on social media, we've put our Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn accounts there. So make sure you're following us on all of our social media outlets. You will also see our podcast link. If you're not subscribed to our podcast, make sure that you do that. It'll give you some great listening, either while you're on your commute to work or when you have some free time during the day. We also have our website there where you can contact us and get on our newsletter list if you are not already on there, as well as check out all of our free, no-cost webinar report podcast offerings that we have through our website. We did record today's event, so we will be turning this around into our archival versions over the next week. That way you can have reference material and you can reference back to today's presentation at any time or pass along to any colleagues that might find this beneficial. We do also have a survey down below the closed captions pod. That's on the right-hand side below the closed captions. So if you click on this survey, that will take you to our short customer satisfaction survey, where we always take into account your opinions to make sure that we are providing you with the best experience and the best content possible. Again, thank you, Dr. Christiansen, for your presentation. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and we hope everyone has a great afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you in our next event.
Recording has stopped.